absolute privilege to introduce a distinguished voice in the global zinc and lead markets, Mr. Joao Jorge, Director of Market Research and Statistics at the International Lead and Zinc Study Group, ILZSG. Mr. Joao Jorge brings with him nearly 2 decades of deep expertise in market analysis, statistics, econometrics, and forecasting. He has been at the forefront of global zinc market intelligence since joining ILZSG in 2006 as the driving force behind ILZSG's monthly statistical bulletins and group's authoritative biennial market forecast. Mr. George's insights are closely followed by industry leaders, policymakers, and analysts worldwide. The ILZSG, formed under the United Nations framework, today includes 27 member countries and is a pillar of transparency and cooperation in the zinc and lead markets. Under Mr. George's leadership, the group continues to be a trusted source of data and research that shapes international decision making. Mr. George excused himself for the live presentation today due to unavoidable situation. And at the same time, we are honored to have his pre-recorded video sharing his expert outlook with us today at Zinc 360 Degrees. Here we go with Mr. George's presentation, specially curated for today's platform. Global overview and forecast of zinc. Thank you. We will just play his video. Thank you. Just play it.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me extend my sincere thanks to Ms. Pina Verma for the kind invitation to speak on the current zinc market situation at this insightful Metal Trendzz webinar. After my recent trip to Nagpur to participate in a great conference on galvanizing organized by PUG and the ILZDA, followed by an online session at a die casting seminar in New Delhi, we are very pleased to continue supporting dynamic market initiatives in India, an esteemed member of the group that is playing an increasingly central role in the global lead and zinc markets. I will start with a quick overview of the lead and zinc study group and then move on to the market analysis, demand for refined metal first, then zinc mine supply, and finally metal supply and the global market balance. The International Lead and Zinc Study Group is an intergovernmental organization originally established by the United Nations back in 1959, with the Secretariat based in Lisbon since 2006, where it has been sharing the same offices with the copper and nickel study groups. The group is supported by 26 member countries that fully fund our annual budget, which means that the group's activity and resources are independent from the industry. The most important role of the group is the promotion of transparency in the lead and zinc markets. And this requires closely monitoring trends in the market fundamentals and releasing a continuous flow of information on production, usage, prices, stocks, and trade via our market forecasts, statistical bulletin, and online databases. The group's twice-yearly market forecasts are compiled largely using country-level supply and demand estimates provided by our members and deliver an unbiased insight into the market's near-term trends. So I will move on to the market analysis and start with global demand for refined zinc metal that is forecast to rise by 1% this year after falling by 0.6% in 2024. Demand in both China and the rest of the world is expected to rise by a similar and relatively modest rates. The IMF recently updated its latest World Economic Outlook projections, stating that the global economy is at a critical stage since major policy shifts are resetting the global trade system and giving rise to uncertainty. In the near term, global growth is projected to fall from 3.3% in 2024 to 2.8% in 2025. And this is lower than the projections in the January update for 2025, with downward revisions for nearly all countries. The economy is expected to slow down in most major economies. However, growth will remain significant in India and China at 6.2% and 4% respectively. In regard to zinc usage, and considering that these economies together account for around 85% of global usage, the group anticipates very modest rises, with the exception of India. Over the next few slides, I will look into zinc usage in most of these countries or regions. And I will start with the largest consumer, China. After declining by nearly 2% last year, Chinese demand is expected to rise by only 0.9% in 2025. Activity at key zinc-consuming industry has been mixed, with production of passenger cars rising substantially, benefiting from recent trade-in policies that are driving up car sales. However, the real estate sector continues to underperform, and property investment fell by around 10%, both last year and in the first months of 2025. On the economic side, there are some recent good news, with GDP growth remaining above 5% in the second quarter, after increasing by 5.4% in Q1, with industrial output also rising at a good pace. Although these indicators exceeded market expectations, there are still challenges that lie ahead. As you know, zinc usage is deeply correlated to the economic and industrial activity, and a number of market analysts fear the impact of the US trade tariffs in the country's manufacturing sector and economy in general. In 2024, the US imported nearly $450 billion of goods from China, and a disruption in this huge trade flow could slow down Chinese growth, with potential consequences in the demand for zinc. In Europe, the combination of weak demand and an improvement in the supply of metal last year has created a surplus in the region that resulted in a notable rise in net exports, as highlighted on the left-hand chart. For this year, the impact of US tariffs in the European manufacturing sector is an issue that should be monitored closely. Despite the ongoing 90-day pause in the tariffs, the recently announced 30% tax over European exports to the US, that is supposed to start in August, could impact, amongst others, the automotive and industrial machinery sectors, both very important zinc consumers. The US is a key market for the EU car exports, having taken in over 700,000 passenger vehicles in 2024, accounting for 14% of total exports by volume and 22% by value. Even if the outcome of this dispute proves to be less severe, It has already driven economic instability, further lowering consumer expectations and business confidence, which had been quite low since the start of the conflict in Ukraine. Despite ongoing challenges, recent indicators point to a modest recovery in industrial activity across the EU, and the study group expects zinc usage in the region to reverse the declining trend seen in recent years and rise slightly by 0.3% in 2025. Apparent demand in the US declined by 8% in 2024, a year marked by difficult conditions for the North American galvanizing industry. The sector faced a reduction in domestic shipments, weaker export activity, and a surge in imports of galvanized products. The US administration justifies recent tariff hikes as part of efforts to reindustrialize the economy, focusing on construction and infrastructure, both major users of galvanized steel. If demand grows and imports become costlier, domestic galvanized sector could revive, increasing US zinc consumption. However, the real-world economy is complex and structural changes take time. Therefore, this logic is exposed to several risks, particularly given that the US refined zinc market remains heavily reliant on imports. And these risks include rising prices of manufactured goods containing zinc, potential demand losses due to substitution, possible supply disruptions, and broader macroeconomic challenges, such as rising inflation and slower economic growth, factors that are typically unfavorable for zinc consumption. Acknowledging that current uncertainties make forecasting particularly challenging, the group projects a relatively contained 1.5% increase in US zinc demand in 2025. Now, let's take a closer look at zinc demand in India, where the outlook is clearly more positive. Apparent demand has grown rapidly in recent years, especially in 2024, when it rose by 8.8%. Looking ahead, a similar increase is expected in 2025. The interim budget for the 2025-26 financial year allocates a hefty $133 billion in capital spending, aimed at boosting economic growth and job creation, with a strong focus on infrastructure development. And that's good news for the zinc industry, since galvanized steel is widely used in projects like highways, airports, railways, and renewable energy structural equipment. For railway infrastructure alone, the government plans to allocate $30.6 billion in both expanding electrification across large parts of the network and the development of major projects for new lines. In regard to zinc mine supply, the group anticipates global output to recover by 4.3% in 2025, after declining over the last 3 years. This year, output is expected to rise in the three largest producers ex-China. In Peru, we are forecasting a recovery from the substantial decline in 2024, thanks to higher production at the Antamina mine, and in Europe, after falling by over 12%, output is forecast to rise significantly this year, benefiting from new or resumed mining capacity that includes higher production at the Vares mine in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the opening of the Ozernoye mine in Russia last September, and the restart of Boliden's Tara operation in Ireland in October. Elsewhere, zinc mine production in India stands out by continuously rising since 2020, thanks to ongoing capacity expansions and efficiency improvements at Hindustan Zinc's operations. Within this group of producers, it's also worth noting that the recent rebound in Mexico's output following a sharp drop in 2023. In contrast, the United States is expected to see a significant decline in production, mainly due to reduced output at the Red Dog mine. I will now move on to the final section of my speech, zinc metal supply and the world balance. The group anticipates that world refined zinc metal output will benefit from an increase in global concentrates availability and rise by 1.8% in 2025. Growth will be driven mainly by China, with smelting activity in the world ex-China remaining relatively stable compared to last year. Some recent developments in the cement smelting industry that have been considered in the group's forecast for 2025 are as follows. In China, a number of new smelters and expansions were commissioned last year, increasing the country's already very large smelting capacity. In Germany, Glencore resumed activity at Nordenham smelter in March 2024, announcing that output would be limited and adapted to demand. In Italy, the Porto Vesme secondary smelter was closed in December, and this was the last lead zinc refining line still operating at this complex. In Norway, Boliden recently completed an expansion at the Odda smelter, increasing its capacity to 350,000 tons per year. Toho Zinc's Anaka smelter in Japan was permanently closed, and in Korea, the Seokpo smelter has been forced to suspend operations for 2 months due to environmental reasons. Finally, lower production guidance for 2025 has been announced by Tech Resources and Trafigura at their operations in Canada and Australia, with Trafigura's Hobart smelter having reduced output by 25% from April and for an undetermined period of time. I would like to add that the possibility of further production curtailments later this year should not be excluded, should market conditions worsen, as some smelters are currently operating on tight margins, driven by low treatment charges and, particularly in Europe, high operation costs and weak demand. Naturally, these developments will influence the production changes forecast for this year, with significant rises in China and Norway, partially offset by declines in the Republic of Korea, Italy, Japan, Canada, and Mexico. By combining forecast demand and supply, the group anticipates a relatively contained surplus of 93,000 tons in 2025, following a nearly balanced market last year. As pointed out earlier, the global economic outlook remains uncertain, and upcoming developments in the US trade tariffs could impact global demand for refined zinc and, to a lesser extent, its supply as well. Thank you.
That was indeed an illuminating session covering global perspective. Mr. Joe is not online, so we will not have the chance to take questions at the moment. But I would request the audience to please pen down the questions and put it in the chat and give your emails. We will certainly get back and see that all the questions are answered.